you're not thinking about testing correctly, right? You should be testing things with the idea that I'm making a function call.
You see this a lot in JavaScript because it's better than a bunch of parameters. That game dev is a very interesting beast when it comes to, applying all of these theories.
Hey, welcome to Dev Better. Today, we're talking about Uncle Bob's third chapter. A little bit of a change of scenery. I'm in my home studio today, home studio in air quotes, off on paternity leave. So we're recording this at home today. I'm a little tired, so if you hear some exhaustion in my voice, children are hard. They are fun, but they're definitely difficult. So today we want to dig into this concept of small functions. And I have the regular crew with me, Jeremy, Maharshi. Say hello to the camera. Everybody knows you by now.
Hello.
And this is one of those very subjective conversations. There's a lot of arguments on the internet about why we would do small functions and why small functions are considered to be good code. And even, pro tip in our interview process, one of the things that we look for is a candidate's ability to take a very complex piece of code and to bring it into smaller, more digestible, interesting pieces. And to me, also the name of those functions is important, just because it helps for readability. Again, we're huge into readability here. We think it's very important to write code for those that come after, as opposed to wherever your current situation is. So let's just dig in and talk about the topic at first. So let's talk about the statement, functions should be small. There's two components to this. One is how small is small, and two is why. Why do we even need these things? I want to hit on a couple of things, but let's kind of run around the room and get your thoughts. So Jeremy, Maharshi, let's start with you, Jeremy. What's your thoughts on this? First off, how small is too small? And second, why would we even do this? What's the point?
Well, how small is too small? I don't know that there is too small, since there's plenty of functions that just are one line. They return something. But too large, maybe 5 lines is ideal, max. There are some IDE plugins you can get that will give you a rating on this even.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think when you go above 5 is when it starts saying hey, maybe you should reconsider. Yeah, I think that's a good measure. It doesn't mean it can't be more than 5 lines, but I think trying to keep it there or less is pretty ideal.
I have an interesting take on this too, because I really think it depends on the semantic flavor of the language you're working in. So 5 lines is a great place to start, but if you're in something that's slightly more verbose, or you're using syntactic sugar that isn't as confusing, because some of the list iterators in Python for whatever reason, my brain can't parse it right. If you're in C, or where you're having to do pointer math and fiddle around with, where your pointers are going, in C++, you're doing a template. I think there are obviously some exceptions to that rule that you have to take into account based on the language you're working in. So I would say we could recalibrate that definition to be 5 lines or less of functional business logic, moving data, fiddling with the actual, what the code is supposed to be doing. Which some people disagree with me on that, but again, for loops require at least 3 lines of nonsense, and if you declare an index outside for some reason, there's 4 lines. Depending on the language. So I would argue it really depends on that syntax, but you're absolutely correct. Why do we do this? What's the entire point?
The idea is just to keep it digestible, so you can look at this and kind of very quickly get an understanding of what this function is doing if the name itself is not clear enough, which of course we talked about naming already. So now we're talking about the contents.
I like top to bottom, left to right, like a book. So one of the big wins for me, and then Maharshi will go to you for well-named and small functions, is that it makes the code read more like a book. So I can just understand, at a controller level, say I'm doing MVC, and I'm in my controller, and I'm very obsessive over what my controller methods are emoting from their names and from their sizes. I can legitimately just read a specification in code and understand exactly what's going on. Now, again, functions, depending on how they're named, it could be confusing, or maybe it's not, doing what you think it is, and that's a different topic. But assuming that you're building these small building blocks that you can then pile on top of each other to give you something readable is good. In school, we were taught to use functions to just encapsulate basic functionalities and specific ideas. I think there's also the readability slant on that. So, Maharshi, what do you think?
Yeah, going back to what you said a little bit earlier about business logic, I'm glad you said that, because then I was going to bring in comments and logging and how that would probably increase the size of your function. But the usage of small functions themselves is readability, right? If somebody's coming after you, they can look at the name of a function and kind of guess where you're going. Can it be too large? I would venture to say yes, especially when you're trying to do multiple things in a function. And you think that those multiple things are one thing, but then you look a little bit closer and you can segment it one thing out to a different function to make it return something. So yeah. And usability wise, I'm talking more about testing, because I love talking about testing. So if you have that function broken apart into smaller components, you could take those out and unit test those individually. And then when you go to integrate it or integration test it, you now have all those small ones that you can confirm are working. So when you integration test it, you don't need to worry about all those branching paths. So yeah.
Yeah, and a common misconception is that breaking one function into a bunch of smaller functions makes testing harder, especially if you're building private methods, private functions. Honestly, if you're doing testing the way you should be, which is behavioral based, using test driven or whatever your favorite flavor of methodology is, then your code coverage should be where it needs to be, because you're exercising all the branches in a particular function that is the parent function or the parent call site for all the other functions that are underneath it. So you don't one anti-pattern is when people create public functions to surface private functions in testing, and that really kind of makes me cringe. I don't like that at all. One, you're surfacing something to the world, even through a test function that could potentially be exploited later. And secondarily, you're not thinking about testing correctly, right? You should be testing things with the idea that I'm making a function call that is this overarching call site that then calls and spiders out into these 15 or 20 different private methods, and the coverage is based on what you're doing inside that giant method. If you're not calling a function, delete it. Why is it in your code base? You can use the source control to go get it back if you want it back. But these are anti-patterns related to function naming that I think are very important.
I wanted to go back to your analogy about the book, like reading it like a book.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about how, functions, if you want to continue that analogy, functions are almost like paragraphs, right? And so if you encounter a paragraph that's really, really long, it's just harder to read. It's harder to wrap your head around what that paragraph means, like what the intent of the paragraph is. And more than likely, it's probably doing too much.
Right, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think on that same line, and sort of the next assertion that you get in Uncle Bob's book, and just generally in this concept, is that functions should only do one thing, and they should do it really well. I see a lot of people not apply this idea to testing, where inside a test, they'll test 4 or 5 things. Now, again, I think there's some lines there that it's okay to cross if you're talking about the behavior of a system. This is where we have to be very careful about not being too dogmatic, right? As with everything in life, it's somewhere in the middle. But this concept of a function should do one thing and it should do it well is, I think, a very easy thing for people to understand. And I think a lot of people do this naturally, because especially if you're into functional programming versus OP, functional programming is stringing together a bunch of f of x's to produce an output on the other side. It's a pipeline of functions. So a lot of people think in terms of, well, this function does this and that function does that and this function does that, because we're taught that in school, or we're taught that in our coding, boot camps, or even if you just read the internet and learn how to code on your own, you learn that things need to be, it only needs to do one thing well. It's kind of like the smartphone, right? Back in the day, phones just called people. Now they do everything. And I would argue that's a bad analogy because these days they're rock solid. But when they were first coming on the market, it was terrible. Like the first iPhone was a complete and utter piece of garbage because it just broke all the time. But what do you guys think about functions should do one thing really well? And I actually have a story that I can talk about where this is very poorly implemented.
One indication that your function isn't doing one thing is when you have "and" in the name. So, I see that sometimes. I'm guilty of that myself. And usually when I see that and think that, I'm like, okay, how can I break this apart so it's not "and" this thing? So, because that's telling me it's doing more than one thing. And I mean, yeah, that if you can't think of a way to get past that and refactor that so that you don't need the "and" there, other than just like naming it something and then keeping it doing two things, it might mean that like the way you're thinking about this problem is not right as well, because you want those functions, like especially like JDEF said with functional programming, like if you think in functional programming terms, functions are they have like an input and an output, and you think of it being that like one-to-one kind of thing, and if it's doing too many things, then you can't think of it that way. You can't use it in a functional sense.
Yeah. It makes testing harder too if it's doing too many things, right?
Absolutely.
And I think a great indicator, in addition to having "and" in the name, that your function is doing too many things is parameter count. If you have 10 parameters on a function, other than a constructor for DI, because DI gets really messy. I don't know, do people use DI these days? Am I dating myself? I'm assuming that people still use DI to some degree.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So apart from a constructor, which again, that's also an indicator that maybe your classes are overworked. It's when you have too many functions or too many objects in your DI path. But let's say that you have a function with 10 parameters. That is a good indicator that your function is very much doing too many things. And quick story on that. When I was consulting for a certain retailer who will remain anonymous, there was a function that I encountered inside, actually it was a class and a function that I encountered inside their order processing code. And the class was 10,000 lines long, which was an initial, okay, what are we doing? That sounds scary. And then this method is 7,000 of the 10,000 lines. And this particular method had, I believe, something on the order of anywhere from 20 to 25 parameters. And some of the parameters, I would guess, and again, I'm trying to dig this out of my brain, so take this with a grain of salt. It may be a bit sensational, but at least 20% of those were Booleans that would switch how the function operated. So you every time you called this function, you would have to pass in all these Boolean parameters and know exactly what branch of code that Boolean parameter would execute, because inside the method, this is burned into my retinas forever, inside the method it would be if parameter, open brace, do the thing, which is 100 lines, close brace, and that's it. There was no else, there was no tree to this. It was legitimately mimicking functions inside this giant God function by simply passing in Boolean parameters. This is like, it's the pinnacle of bad engineering that I've seen in my career, and one of the most frustrating things I've ever had to work with. Now, we spent time, my team and I went through and very nicely told the developers of this that this is not good. This is a very bad practice. You should never be doing these things. And we refactored that particular method and, broke things out, but we still ended up having, 200 lines because we didn't understand the business logic. There wasn't any particular tests in place, but we were at least able to, and this is a good segue into the next point, we were at least able to break things into functions very cleanly, right? Because of that if Boolean, do the thing, close parent. That's a very simple pattern to just scoop everything out of that if statement, drop it into a function, and then pass that Boolean in, or do however you want to kind of hack the crap out of it to make it look decent. But this is a good sort of a good segue. I don't from a method perspective, you have no excuse but to write small methods. because in 2024, IDEs have this wonderful right-click refactor button. JetBrains is phenomenal, and Visual Studio is also phenomenal, probably better than JetBrains in many ways, of snagging a piece of code and transforming it into a function. It's really, really easy to do. So really it just comes down to an exercise of figuring out where to kind of chunk these things out. All right, so Maharshi, we kind of skipped you. What do you think about sort of the function should only do one thing? What's your thoughts on that?
I agree. I want to start that off before I get spears thrown at me for my next thing. It's hard to tell when that one thing ends and you're moving on to another thing, right? So let's say, for example, you have running and walking. When does running start and walking stop, right? So let's say my experience in game dev, right? Usually you just use a kind of like a slider and you just slide it. And so if I was to implement that in code, that slider would be doing both walking and running. So it's not exactly one thing. To kind of show in like two different methods, right? If I wasn't doing a slider, if I was just doing this is walking and this is running, you could put a Boolean at some point in the parameter. And then when that Boolean is there, you'll move to the other version of that function. Basically, you're overloading the original function. It's still a separate function, but the name is the same, right? Which kind of brings me to parameters. At which point are there too many parameters, too little parameters? If you're shoving all of your parameters into an object and then trying to pass that off as a Trojan horse of parameters, you know? So what are your thoughts on that, Jeremy? Either one.
Well, which Jeremy, right? I'll go first. So the configuration object pattern I've used before. I've experimented with both, honestly. And I think it just depends on the readability and the problem you're solving. I mean, JavaScript, look at JavaScript. Like, there's this really terrible pattern in JavaScript, which is the entire language. But on top of that, where people pass these giant JSON objects through their methods, and I don't know what the hell that thing is doing. I have no clue what these parameters. Like, go back to jQuery days and try and make what's called an XHR call, or like a XML request call back in the day. Try and make one of those using jQuery, and you will spend at least 15 minutes with the documentation trying to figure out what the hell it's doing before you can actually make the call, because it's a giant JSON blob payload. So I don't like that. I do like configuration objects when they're clean and simple, and for when it makes sense. But I'm more of a classical OOPist, right? That's what I learned in school. It's what I've learned in my career. So I tend to like to put things into packages that make sense, as opposed to just throwing everything into a God mode object.
I think that it's not, I mean, sometimes you can't get around this, right? Like, if you look at the builder pattern, I think a lot of people would agree that the builder pattern is pretty good. And one of the ways that you implement the builder pattern, you have a builder object that has a bunch of different configuration methods on it, and it sets all these variables and whatnot, and then when you call build, it's going to pass all of that data to a new class, and it's either going to do that with a bunch of parameters, or it's going to pass the builder itself to the class, which is this Trojan horse that you said. But I love that depiction of this, by the way. It's going to pass this object in that has all these configuration values. And I mean, sometimes that's totally reasonable. And I think that, like, you see this a lot in JavaScript, because it's better than a bunch of parameters, right? Yeah. Just because it depends on the language that you're using and the syntax and whatnot and what it allows. Some JavaScript doesn't allow, optional parameters.
Right.
I think. Yeah. And so, that's the way you get around that, right? You use an object that can contain these optional things. And same with Python. Like, you have a lot of methods or functions that have lots of parameters, and they're optional. And you see this in, like, some of the libraries, like Pandas for data manipulation. for just different ways to load a file or something. Because sometimes it's like, you want to load a file, but like there's some specifics there. And I guess the alternative would be like, okay, well, let's have different functions with different names to do the different things rather than all these extra parameters. And you could do that, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily better. Like you're going to end up with, if you went through all the permutations of option combinations in a Python function, you'd end up with like hundreds of methods potentially. Right. And I'm not sure that's better for figuring out how to use this. So definitely, it depends on the language and it depends on what you're doing.
Agreed. Yeah, it's you mentioned the builder pattern. I feel like the builder pattern is this chimera that was chimera, however you say that was created, and it's this hodgepodge of both good engineering practices and terrible engineering practices. But it's such a good. I like it. I enjoy the builder pattern, and when I built my first builder, it was a great exercise in learning how to manage the visibility of pattern or the visibility of certain, values on a class, right? Because you're using subclasses and inner classes. If you're in Java, I think I tried to do it in C# and couldn't do it. I don't remember. It's been a while. But the builder pattern is a great example of a way to kind of package your code up such that it's readable, but when you crack it open, you have no clue what it's doing. At least that was me. But yeah, that's a great example. I don't like Python. Sorry, Python people. Significant white space is dumb. But then on top of that, that's another reason that I think Python is difficult for a lot of people to sort. Is there's so many inherent things you have to know, like KW-args, like how many optional parameters are on this. At least PHP. Shout out to my PHP people.
Oh no,
make you put like something in the method to show that it is an optional parameter. In C# too, right? There's the keywords for optional parameters in C#. And I don't know, optional parameters I feel like can be abused at times as well in certain languages. And I think it goes back to what you said, Jeremy, is that, think about what you're doing instead of just passing a giant blob of configuration. Because I feel like languages like JavaScript and Python, they kind of price you into this and they don't give you a choice because that's the only tool you have. You don't have any other way of getting things into a class. All right, so let's look at some code and kind of digest it for a minute. Maharshi, I think you have a great example. Let's get started with you.
So this is the move script. Before I get started on what it is, let me talk about what it's used for. So this was a function that I used in a game that I made in college, and it's using the SteamVR plugin from days old, so it's probably much better looking now. But all this did is take your stick that you have on your Steam controller, use the angles that it's at, and move you in that direction. Pretty straightforward. Plus one other thing that it did that doesn't really make sense for it to be there. So we'll get to that. So on line 31 of the move script is the start function. Before the game starts, right, or as the game is starting, all the start scripts run. So it sets up your objects, sets up your components, and then attaches them, depending on if you have those. Line 47, which is the update function, this will run once every frame, right? So if you have 60 frames a second, this will run 60 times in a second. So you have to be really careful about putting loops in here because you could end up with an infinite loop without even realizing that you have it. So this function is only supposed to check, is only supposed to guide your movement. But if you look at line 70, you'll see slow time.getState down, then SteamVR sources right hand. So for some reason, in a script about movement, I have a button that'll slow down time.
No, I think that's a good call out. So this is a good example of a function that's doing perhaps too many things. How would you refactor that? Because this is built into your update function. So what are your thoughts on how you would make that better?
So conveniently, this is written for Unity. What I could do is I could take that and move it to its own script that parallels this, right? So start, update, and then I would just copy paste it, and it would be its own component. I could then move that to whatever component that I need to, or object that I need to. So let's say I have my right hand, right? I would just stick that component on there and boom. Now it's no longer in the same line of code, but it is still functioning as it's supposed to.
I like that. That's an example of using the framework to make your life better, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a thing that's an out people don't typically consider is what can the framework give you that makes life better in that case?
I want to add also that game dev it's a very interesting beast when it comes to applying all of these theories with clean code and stuff, because if you spend too much time thinking about that, then you may not end up with a game. And
Sure.
Some advice that I've been given with game dev is just like, it's okay to move fast, it's okay to write bad code if it means the difference between actually making a game and not making a game. And so like sometimes, like for instance, I could see this method on line 54. Just immediately something that stood out was like maybe you could have a simple private method here that generates this vector, and just be one line, or sorry, line 55. So be one line instead of those three lines, 55 to 57 there. And so, I guess it's all four of those lines really. You could do that in a private method.
Right.
But if you spend too much time thinking about that, like that's time you're taking away from actually completing this game. And the win there is not super big. So, I mean, I think the thing you pointed out on line 70, that might be more worth shifting into something else. Like if you could do this in a different class that would handle that by itself, then maybe that's worth it. But I think the things that are important when it comes to game design is like when it gets too hard because you're repeating the same stuff a lot, like that's a good time to think like, how can I make this cleaner? How can I refactor this? Like things that are going to make it easier for you to continue to write the code.
Yeah.
So it's a bit different when we're talking game design, but there are cases where using clean code concepts are beneficial.
Yeah, I think the best
Mm-hmm.
clean code concepts to apply to game design is organizational. It's more about finding what you need. I would not bat an eye at a 3,000 line function in a game, which I know people are gonna maybe send me hate mail over that. But it again, as you said, Jeremy, it's just a great synopsis that game development is fundamentally different than developing some SaaS product where you have 600 engineers and 20% of them are in Argentina and 20% of them are in India, and you have to have some form of cohesive strategy around updating that product, right? And your lead times are different because when you're in the entertainment industry, you have similar to the way movies are made, right? You have a shelf life. You have to get something out. I mean, just look at like Diablo 4, or there's a bunch of great examples in the ARPG space right now where games have been shipped that are just half-assed and they're not ready, and people are very frustrated and annoyed. And 9 months later, we're actually getting a functional game. That type of approach where ship the smallest thing possible that provides some form of entertainment to people. I don't know that works in game dev, which is an interesting topic. Maybe we'll hit on that sometime. But I agree that whole from line 54 to 57 could be put into its own function. Is that high value? Probably not. Could you do it in 20 seconds with your IDE? Absolutely. So I would argue, again, back to the economics that you hit on, Jeremy, it's all about what is the best bang for my buck right now. Software economics, right? It's a thing that you can't skew too far to the right and just do the most beautiful abstract thing, and you can't skew too far to the left and do the most hacky get it out the door thing, or you end up with a 10,000 line class like my nightmare that I described earlier. So again, it's all about the economics, and that takes wisdom and time and experience.
One other quick note about the game design aspect. A lot of games these days, like Diablo 4, are made and then continuously updated.
Yeah.
And in a situation like that, it's going to matter more when you're using clean code, because you're going to be coming back and rereading this and having to make changes. But when you're looking at a game like this, you probably never came back to this, right? You finish the game and then you're done. And that's how games used to always be, right? And there's still games that are made that way. And so if you're not going to be coming back to this and updating it, then these things don't matter as much.
Cool. Jeremy, what about you? You have a great example, I think.
Yeah, we can go back and look at my lock and key plugin for Minecraft. In the lock registry, I chose this. It's got some good stuff. It's got some not so great stuff. If we look at load locks on line 63, this function's definitely something I would say is a little too long. And I see some immediate areas where it could be improved. So for example, we've got a Lambda function in here going into this data worker submit call on line 64. Well, everything in there could be its own function. And I could be calling this in data worker submit, even with like a method reference syntax. And that would, that's how many lines? We're looking at 12 lines of code there that could be its own function and not be here. And that would just make this more clear. If that was well named, we could say, okay, well, what are we submitting to the data worker? Okay, this like lock loading thing or something. And then we do the blocking, and clean up. It's doing cleanup afterwards. So it's doing too many things as well. Maybe. Yeah. That's
about this is an example of what we were talking about earlier, where there's some boilerplate that you just can't get around that's going to violate your 5 lines, right? So your try catches, you have a pair of try catches, and obviously you could look at factoring one entire try catch into its own method, but I feel like that using that as a general rule of thumb can get you into trouble. And you also have a little bit of logging, and those things, are aspects and sort of ancillary to the business logic, and I would not count those if I were reading this function. Granted, it does make it a bit confusing because there's so much space taken up by the machinery of the language. But the key pieces of the function are line 66 to 71 and line 80 and line 84, and everything else is just boilerplate. So I think you probably hit that. What is that? 72. That's 4. That's 6 lines, 7. You got an 8-line function, dude. It's fine.
Yeah, it's not terrible. I mean, again, that cleanup locks call on line 84 is like, is that really the responsibility of load locks? Maybe. That's something where you could consider like, okay, maybe this is the responsibility of the caller. I mean, I guess it's a private method here, but like, it does kind of hint at maybe this doing too much.
Well, I think another line you have to walk here is that eventually all of your calls are going to converge somewhere. The point of your function doing too many things, I think, applies more to private functions as opposed to what people call controllers or like an entry point method, especially going back to the game design. You have your game loop. Your game loop has to do multiple things, right? Otherwise, you don't have a functioning piece of software. So I would say that you're right to say that maybe this isn't the right place. Maybe it's the caller's responsibility. But I bet the caller's doing something other than just loading locks, right? The caller's probably got 2 or 3 things it's trying to do. And it really just boils down to what's the best path for one, exception handling in a language like Java or C#. You got to think about that so you're not using exceptions for control flow, because that's an anti-pattern that I really don't like. And then on top of that, how do we delegate responsibility or in the right way, in the right place, but at the same time avoid this sort of function should do one thing, which again, I really think that you can violate that sometimes. You just have to be careful and strategic about it. No, I like this function. It's good. It's nice and small and clean. And I think kind of to end it off, I actually want to challenge the audience to something. There is RIP HashiCorp. They were bought by IBM. So all of my teams are moving off of Terraform now. Sorry, not sorry. But inside the remote state S3 client.go file in Terraform, in the code for Terraform, there's a function that starts on line 65 and it ends on line 120. And this function is really interesting. And I think that I would like for you all to take a look at this function and potentially tell me, either in the comments or you can send us an email or whatever, on some ways that, or even submit a PR. That would be awesome. On ways to make this better, because I think that this function is a bit crazy. There's an infinite for loop in here with a timer. Like, that's fun. Line 78 to line 116 is a break and a continue on 110. All kinds of crazy stuff happening in this particular file. And I do think that it is a little bit overloaded. It's doing too many things, and it's also a little bit big. So I'm going to challenge you guys to send us what you think and to give us your input on this particular function. What do you think should be done to break it into some smaller pieces? But with that, I think we're going to wrap this episode up. I appreciate everybody watching. Jeremy, Maharshi, thanks for your time, gents, and the examples. It was a good chat. This is one of my favorite series that we've done on Dev Better. I really enjoy talking about this kind of stuff and, waxing poetic over sort of the philosophy of software. In 2024, lots of things have changed since Uncle Bob's book was been written. New languages have come out. New ideas have been put onto the internet, and there's a lot of embracing of some of the things that we used to think were bad practices, right? Like, it's okay to repeat yourself sometimes now, depending on what you're doing. Just like anything, apply these concepts with wisdom in mind. Don't just broadly say everything's bad if it's over 5 lines, because again, like we said, boilerplate, and there's other reasons that, maybe it doesn't make sense to break this into a small function. But definitely don't write 7,000 line functions. That's a dumb idea. Appreciate everybody. We'll talk to you on the next one.